So for this Shabbat, I want to share something not about the Torah portion of the week, but in terms of our calendar. Because in the Jewish calendar, there's something really significant that's approaching, and the first marker of it happened just this past week. But a lot of us we're not so familiar with this holy day, certainly not a holiday. It's kind of a sad time. You see, we passed already the 7th day of the Hebrew month of Tammuz, which marks in history, in Jewish history, the time when the walls of Jerusalem are breached. And it's just a few weeks until we get to Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of the Hebrew month of Av. And Tisha B'Av is the day that marks the destruction of the first and second holy temples in Jerusalem. It always happens in the summer, which is, I think, why a lot of Americans don't know about this, right? Because, except for you folks, most people are Jewish during the school year, right? There's drop-off, we have plans, there's certain holidays we come to, but Tisha B'Av, it's we don't really know about it. Now, we have two different experiences of growing up, if you have any sense of Tisha B'Av. One is, during these 3 weeks, the superstitious evil eye is lurking, and we don't go to the beach, because bad things happen around Tisha B'Av, just like for our ancestors, the destruction of the temple. My mother believed that. There's another idea of Tisha B'Av, is when you don't really want to do something, you would say, I'll get to that next Tisha B'Av, right? It just means we're going to ignore this, it's going to be gone, and I kind of feel a little sad about that, actually. I'm making these little jokes, but where nobody was laughing, but the real part of this idea is that I think Tisha B'Av is something really significant. I think it teaches us truths, not just because we remember another sad thing that happens in Jewish history. I think there's so much more than that. I think it's more than just another calamity that we're going to remember. Now, in Jewish tradition, on Tisha B'Av, it's a day of mourning. It's a fast day. All of the mourning customs are kind of in sync or in effect, and it's really this very solemn kind of a day. And the rabbis are looking at this because they need to understand why bad things happen. Not so different from us, they're human beings after all. So they wondered to themselves, why was the first temple destroyed? Now, just for the context, the first temple is destroyed in the year 586 BCE, before the Common Era, right? The Babylonians destroy the first temple. They're exiled. It's really difficult. By the waters of Babylon, remember that song. And then at some point later, the Babylonians lose their own war. We're allowed back. There's a rebuilding, but eventually there's going to be a second destruction, that one by the Romans in the year 70 of the Common Era, okay? So the rabbis who are speaking and writing at the very end of the Second Temple time, and when it's destroyed, they become the clear leaders of the Jewish community. They're wondering, why was the first temple destroyed? And they say there's because of 3 evil things that happened. One was idolatry, avodah zarah, this not just worshiping idols, but kind of going after phony gods, because that was going to lead you to bad behavior. So there was idolatry, there was immorality, and there was also bloodshed. And then they asked, what about the second temple? The second temple, people were studying Torah, and they were doing mitzvot, and they were doing gimilut chasadim, all of these righteous, good deeds that people were celebrating. So why was the second temple destroyed? And they said it's because of baseless hatred. Sinat chinam, this baseless, no reason for it, but people just hated, and they acted that out. So they could study Torah in the yeshiva, in some kind of school, learning environment, but if their actions were going to be filled with hate, then it nullifies everything that they were doing ritually. Rabbis make it very clear about that. Baseless hatred is weighed just as heavily as those other 3 kinds of immoral sins. And for our sages, it's not the emperor of Babylonia, Nebuchadnezzar. It's not him that attacks, but God kind of uses the Babylonians as an agent to punish. Now, that's not my theology. Folks who hang out here a lot know that. I don't believe that that's how God acts, but I do believe that's what they believed. And so there's still something to learn about it. But the rabbis continue to talk about all of these ideas and how do we make sense of hard things that happen in the world. You see, the Jews, during that Second Temple time, they really behaved ritually pretty well, but they had all of this bad behavior. And they kind of used this illustration of sinat chinam, this baseless hatred, using two people. One, his name is Kamza, and the other is Bar Kamza. It's kind of a silly story on some level, but there's a deep truth that's in it. You see, they're enemies, but one of them gets the invitation to the other's party. You already see this is kind of a silly idea. And so he comes, but the one that is the host doesn't want him there, and he's throwing him out. He says, please, I'll pay you, I'll do whatever you need. Just don't humiliate me in front of all of these other people. But one does exactly that. He kicks him out of the party. He casts him out of the community. And that's where we see this kind of baseless hatred. These kinds of explanations sounds a little simple, I get it. And we know from history that there's incredible disputes and antagonism among Jews during the second time. But there's something else that happens too that I think is really significant that comes from the Talmud. The Talmud teaches that there's this very famous sage, right? Later living sage. His name is Rabbi Yochanan. He's living in the 3rd century or so in the land of Israel. And he kind of makes this radical statement. He says that Jerusalem was destroyed only because they gave judgments in accordance with the laws of the Torah. So basically he says they followed the rules. And that's why Jerusalem is destroyed. So his students are saying, what gives? We should act as amateur judges. We shouldn't really be serious about the text. But when the letter of the law becomes more powerful than its soul, and people get hurt, then it doesn't matter what the letter of the law is actually saying. The rabbis of the Gemara, of our Talmud, are saying the law is important, but so is this. So is looking at a non-legal context, trying to bring our teachings not just into legal space, but into ethical space, into rational space, into relationship space. So Yochanan is saying, if you follow the law that strictly, there's no mercy. It's just the law. When we look at Tisha B'Av and the destruction of the temple, and we see what our rabbis are teaching us, I think they're telling us to analyze what happened, not just in terms of another historical episode, but as a paradigm of conflict, of a lack of listening, of a lack of empathy and care, an inability to be present for one another, to do Jewish and make it look good for God without thinking about what's the impact of our decisions. Our rituals are to inform our behaviors. Our rituals have that ethical impulse to help us see something more clearly rather than just do what we're told. So I'm going to suggest for us on this Shabbat, alongside the importance of religious observance and the importance, the essential aspects of Jewish education and general education, these sources are emphasizing to us that a society has to be based on respect and integrity and a willingness to compromise personal interest for the welfare of a larger community. So here's the important piece. Observing Tisha B'Av, however we do it, it doesn't have to be with a fast. I don't fast. I don't fast, as our tradition says, on Tisha B'Av. Not because I can't. I've got like a week's, I'm good, right? Just making sure you're still listening. I don't fast because in Jewish tradition, my read of Jewish tradition is that a fast is because of sin. And so I fast on Yom Kippur. It's of mixing the mark. I don't believe that for Tisha B'Av that God destroyed Jerusalem out of punishment, and so I don't fast. But that's just me. But the idea of observing this day of sadness and mourning, we have to recognize that there's other aspects than just being sad. The mood of Tisha B'Av changes on the day in the afternoon. In the morning, people would wear a talis. Usually on a weekday, one would wear a talis and tefillin, right? When you wrap yourself up with those straps and the head box, so that's tefillin. You would wear that in the morning. Not on Shabbat, that's why we don't see it here. You would wear that in the mornings. You don't wear it on Tisha B'Av because it's supposed to be an act of joy, but in the morning of Tisha B'Av, you don't see it. But in the afternoon, you do. And in the afternoon, you have other kinds of readings on Tisha B'Av, a day of mourning and fasting, that also shows some messages of hope, of an ability to rebuild. In Jewish tradition, the Messiah, the one who is supposed to bring peace to all of the world, is going to be born on Tisha B'Av, the day that marks this most intense sadness on the Jewish calendar. So what do I learn from that I want to share with you? We've been through dark times before. We have been fighting with others and fighting against ourselves before. Tisha B'Av can be a time for tikkun, for going back to wholeness and improvement in the lives of all of us and of the Jewish people and of humanity. So we can listen to the hurt. We can cry out like the Jews of ancient years without hiding, really listening. And then we can respond again with hope and healing. If we abandon Tisha B'Av, we run the risk of learning insensitivity to suffering, and we become unconscious about who we are and where we have been, and it's easy for some sovereign can come up and try and conquer again if we don't recognize hurt. And on the other hand, if we fail to begin to heal, we also have a challenge because we don't recognize the power of gratitude and the possibility of what could be. So Tisha B'Av, the day of destruction of the holy temples, countless lives were lost. We need to remember hurt, the anguish, their call for where was God, the way we have called for where was God. Then an idea that even still in the midst of hurt, there can be hope. But that takes a lot of work. And that, I think, is why we have Tisha B'Av when we do. So the other day, the walls were breached. We're approaching a time of calamity of our Jewish calendar. But then also right afterwards, we have these weeks where we have readings of comfort and healing that brings us to Rosh Hashanah, a new beginning, a new year, new opportunities, but real sense of renewal.